Welcome to the Last Week on Earth podcast. I'm your host, Louisa Magnussen. The Labour Party conference for 2025 was held in Liverpool from Sunday, September 28th to Wednesday, October 1st. This was the party's first conference as the UK's ruling party since they were last in power in 2010. Kier Starmer's conference speech acknowledged the discontent and growing impatience amongst the public for the government, and he announced significant policy changes. This is Last Week on Earth, and I would now like to welcome my guest, journalist Gavin O'Toole, to discuss the outcomes of the conference in more detail and give you an overview of what it means for Britain and beyond. Welcome, Gavin. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you, Wizzi. Hello, and how are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to episode 2 of Last Week on Earth. I think we were warming up last week, weren't we?
Yeah, getting into the swing of it, yeah, but we'll get hot, white hot today.
White hot today, we will indeed. So first off, can you please give us an overview, just briefly, of the situation the Labour Party found itself in as it headed into its conference earlier this week?
Yes, so this is a really important conference for Labour. As you say, it's the first one since they came to power, but also the background is the rise of reform. And of course, Labour's doing very, very badly in opinion polls, which indicate a reform lead over the party of between 3 and 16 percentage points. If you were to translate that into seats, that would be potentially disastrous for Labour. If there was an election today, that would be catastrophic.
They'd be out, wouldn't they? No question about it.
They'd be out. A Sunday Times MRP survey shows that Reform could win 373 seats on those figures at the next election, with Labour reduced to just 90. So a rump Labour Party. But there's a bigger problem for Labour, and in particular for Sir Kier Starmer, the Prime Minister. He continues to be extremely unpopular among voters. And poll figures for party leaders all give him a negative rating. A negative rating is between those, the difference between those satisfied and those dissatisfied. And the maximum negative rating he's had recently was minus 66%. He is actually now the most unpopular Prime Minister on record. That's the lowest satisfaction rate for any Prime Minister recorded by, in this case, Ipsos, since the polls were set up in 1977. And that even includes Liz Truss, who's sort of cack-handed.
It was likened to a lettuce.
Yes, Liz Truss for lettuce, whose lowest net satisfaction rating was recorded as minus 51. So he's even more unpopular than Liz Truss.
Well, that is significant. Now, has Kier Starmer's reputation been wounded by scandals, or is this low rating very much deserved? What do you think?
Well, it's not for me to say really whether it's deserved or not, but definitely the background to this is policy mistakes and, of course, lots of scandals. So there's been about 16 major controversies since Labour took power last year. I could go through them all, but let's just pull out some of the big ones. The rebellion over two-child benefit was the big sort of challenge, the first big challenge he faced. Secondly, the freebies scandal. Starmer and a number of his cabinet ministers had been taking gifts prior to the election, which came out in the press. And that is a bad look for Labour, of course, which talks...
That's happened before, hasn't it, with previous governments?
It's happened before, and politicians are constantly offered things. I guess the challenge for a politician is to say no. If you're offered tickets to a concert, you can always say no and say, I'll get my own tickets. Why do you have to accept free? I can't get free tickets, can I? You can't get free tickets, so why should they have?
Is it an abuse of power? Do you think it'd be abuse of being in the spotlight and being a bit of a celebrity? And do you think they get a bit, oh, free things. Oh, aren't I lucky? Yes,
absolutely.
It's nice to accept it, without realising the implications on their own reputation.
Yes, it's a really bad look, particularly for Labour, because Starmer came in promising a kind of new integrity in government following a series of previous scandals under the Tories. So, that in itself is hypocritical. But secondly, Labour is meant to be the party of equality. It's meant to be a party where politicians do not kind of assume a position of privilege. So it is definitely an abuse of power. It doesn't necessarily break any laws, so we can't accuse them of law breaking. But at the end of the day, what are they there for? They're there, presumably, to represent us. They're not there to line their pockets.
It's a bad look overall, really, isn't it?
But let's go through some of these other scandals or missteps that have hit Starmer. Sue Gray's resignation, his chief of staff, that was all very embarrassing. The MP who punched a constituent Mike Amesbury, the Labour MP who was arrested and then had to resign. Resignations, Louise Haigh for some kind of past misdemeanor, Tulip Siddiq, the business minister, for her connections with the Bangladeshi regime. There's been sackings, there's been U-turns over international aid, the winter fuel payment, in particular the grooming gangs inquiry, where they conceded under huge pressure to start looking into a running sore really in many communities. The benefit cuts U-turn. Most recently, Ushnara Ali's resignation over housing and being a landlord. And of course, Angela Rayner's resignation and Peter Mandelson's resignation. So they're kind of falling, they're jumping like rats from a ship, sinking ship, aren't they? And so Starmer has been weakened by these scandals. It looks as if he's not got a grip really on it, not only on his own party and his own cabinet, but presumably the country as well.
What are the financial problems the country is currently facing?
Okay, so they're huge. There are great expectations at the moment of the next budget, which will be in November the 26th, against the background of serious concerns about the public finances. That's what governments spend and what they take in on taxes. And there's been nothing but bad news on the public finances for the last 14 months. So I think today the Office for Budget Responsibility will deliver its first estimate to the Treasury of the state of the projected state of the public finances in the coming years. And that's going to be of great importance because the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has committed to a set of rules, fiscal rules, which are limits on how high the current budget and a measure of the national debt could get. And so the OBR's opinion is going to be very important. And the main issue is this so-called black hole between what the Chancellor is likely to have to spend if she sticks to those rules and the OBR's estimates of what she can spend, the current budget. And that black hole at the moment seems to be about 30 billion, 20 to 30 billion pounds. That's an awful lot of money that she's going to have to find. And it's very, very hard to see how she can fill that gap just with tax rises. She wants to raise tax, but she made this quite foolish promise at the start of the cycle, but she wouldn't raise tax, and she's going to have to backtrack on that. That's bad enough. But tax rises alone won't cut the mustard. She's going to have to also consider cuts, and that obviously means cuts to cherished Labour sort of programmes and sort of areas of welfare.
Where do you think those cuts are going to be made? What does it look like? What are we going to lose, essentially?
Well, really, the only thing that she can cut under current commitments is aspects of the welfare budget. But the welfare budget is obviously very, very large. They've tried to cut welfare, these personal independence payments. They couldn't because of rebel Labour MPs. But ultimately, I think there are some very difficult choices on cutting welfare for some of the most vulnerable groups in society. And I'm not going to voice an opinion on what's right and what's wrong here. Cutting welfare is always very painful. There may be room for manoeuvre in some areas, but there's not a lot, to be honest.
What about immigration? Can you talk us through the Home Secretary's attempt to win back reform voters by proposals to make permanent residency more difficult?
Yes, so Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, made a speech at conference in which she sort of she tried to take on directly some of the talking points that Reform has been putting out mischievously prior to Labour's conference. And she basically has signalled that the conditions for migrants to remain in this country with indefinite leave to remain, or i.e. permanent residence, will be tightened. And the idea is to look tougher on immigration to try and kind of close the gap of what are seen as potentially sort of loose or abusive areas. So she says things that they've said before many times, Labour, they're going to toughen the standards for the use of English. You've got to have English to a high standard, got to have a clean criminal record. Well, that kind of goes without saying. This is a gimmick, you've got to volunteer in your community. I don't know how the hell they're going to make that work.
How are they going to enforce that?
I don't know. How you can enforce that, I just do not know. And also, it seems a bit rich making migrants volunteer in the community when, for example, they don't make rehabilitation in prisons do the same thing. So why should migrants volunteer when prisoners who've actually damaged society are not required to volunteer. It seems a bit
Absolutely. And the
gimmicky.
taxpayer pays for the prisoners to live and survive and to eat and be accommodated. And
Yeah.
what are they making them give back? And I see
Uh,
what you're saying. Yeah.
of course, and of course, a lot of migrants come here to not only to earn a living, but to try and prosper. So, if you're expecting them to do all this other stuff, that's obviously going to get in the way of trying to survive in a quite difficult economic environment. So I
And
think these
working to
things
pay
are
taxes as well. If they have to
working to
volunteer,
pay.
how are they gonna do? They can't fulfill a full-time job and can't pay the tax that comes from that. Seems a bit mad, doesn't it?
It's mad. And also, taxes are a contribution. We all contribute to society by paying our taxes. If they pay their taxes like everyone else, obey the law, why isn't that good enough? I think these are gimmicky, but the point here is that Labour is now very much on the back foot when it comes to immigration because of those Reform Party polling figures. So they're kind of dreaming up areas where they can appear tough and sort of try and wrap themselves in the flag in the same way that Nigel Farage is doing at the head of Reform. Is this a good strategy? It probably is the only strategy. The problem is it will alienate core Labour voters. It will probably alienate potential Labour voters, and it may not even do what it's meant to do, which is to pull those voters back from Reform into the Labour fold. So Starmer's also started to act tough and talk tough, and there's been quite a lot of speculation since his conference speech on Wednesday that this new sort of authoritative tough talking is going to turn the tide. I doubt it, to be honest, because it's not necessarily tough talking that's making him so unpopular, or lack of tough talking,
Feels
so
like
to speak.
clutching at straws in a way.
It feels like touching at straws, and also, unless there's a sort of dramatic change in the issue in particular of small boats crossing the channel, I can't see how Starmer can dress that up as progress. I mean, this is regardless of how you and I may feel personally about the issue, because obviously, in the long run, the general consensus among academics is that migration contributes enormously to this country, not just economically, which is what everyone talks about, but sort of socially, culturally. And there's a good reason for that, because migrants come with a kind of zest to get on and to do well. They bring skills that have been not so much lost in this country, but we've just failed to tap into them. So migration in itself should never be an issue. I suppose getting a proper grip on migration is always going to be up for discussion, and that's really the issue here.
I think it's legal migration and immigration versus illegal migration and immigration, isn't it? And whether we're getting it's the skilled people versus the people, the sort of desperate people. And it must be awful to be one of these people, but can the country support lots of small boat people when they're not going to contribute skill wise and all of that? That's the real issue, isn't it?
It is the issue. And in fact, ultimately, part of that welfare bill that we've been talking about, which is becoming a bit of a headache for Rachel Reeves, is obviously spent, rightly in support of asylum seekers. At the end of the day, though, the argument against migration, and particularly illegal migration, has been driven by the rhetoric of parties like Reform and those who are further right than Reform. And they have pulled out some very, what would you call it, dangerous talking points, particularly focusing on the risks posed by migrants to, for example, women and to small communities. And I think this is just, as Labour says, and the right hates this when you say it, this is what's called dog whistle politics. They're using sort of signature issues to create a sense of alarm, create this idea that we're somehow being overwhelmed by migration,
I
attacked.
get the feeling from a lot of mainstream media and what's going on with the talk that's going on Twitter and platforms like X and platforms like that. There's a lot of fear mongering, I think. Is
And
that
there's a lot
fair?
of that's absolutely fair. And there's also a lot of fear. If you actually take the time to talk to people who've come into this country from other countries, particularly people of color, you will actually learn that they are scared. And this is a
Mm,
very, very worrying, this is very un-British, and it's a very
mm,
worrying development. So, for example, in my own family, there are relatives who are not white. And frankly, I've been given some very alarming signals that these people are getting nervous. They're getting scared by what is being said.
And
So,
that's horrendous. That
it is
we
horrendous.
can't accommodate that. That's like you said. That's so un-British, apart from
It's
anything
un-British.
else.
Yeah, it is totally un-British, and at the end of the day, this is the kind of American school of politics we're dealing with here. This has been imported, this fear-mongering, if not from America, from kind of some of the darker experiences Europe has had, and it has to end. We're a country of law and we're a country of order, and ultimately, there's no place for this in our society. But I'm afraid because Labour's and previous governments have mishandled this issue, they've given space to people who play up and alarm the public about risks that really, frankly, may not even exist.
I completely hear you. Has any progress been made on manifesto commitments? Did we find out from the conference this week?
Well, prior to conference, there was a lot of discussion about this. And in conference, they don't actually tend to bang on about their achievements because they're so open to being, undermined by but what about this arguments. Let's go through some of those manifesto commitments and see if what they've done, have they been up to form? So economic growth, obviously, we've just talked about that. We're kind of failing on growth. I mean, the very first of Labour's missions before coming to government was to rebuild Britain and to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7. Now, early into the term, they managed to do that, but only because growth in the G7 was so bad. More recently, when figures in the G7 are improving, Britain has slipped, and I think it's now joint third in the G7. So they're failing on that mission at the moment. And if Rachel Reeves can't get a grip on the public finances, that's going to get a lot worse. Another commitment, increased wages as part of that economic sort of background. And that's because of the pressure caused by the cost of living crisis, the kind of legacy of inflation, which is still quite high. They're kind of really struggling to increase wages, and the demands for public sector wage increases are growing. And that obviously has to be resisted by the Chancellor because of the risk of inflation. Waiting times in the NHS, they have made some progress in terms of the backlog, but most of it, or a lot of it, has been by shuffling figures. The NHS backlog in appointments has flatlined, but in general, the trend seems to be still going upwards. And so they'll probably miss their targets by next year. So they're struggling. Obviously, we've just talked about stopping the boats. In itself, that policy area is not succeeding. And of course, that's leading to, as we've just discussed, all kinds of other social and community issues and political issues. But Kier Starmer has tried to basically mirror his predecessor, Rishi Sunak, on this. And it's interesting that now he's talking about modifying the EHRC, which are basically the rules governing Britain's treatment of asylum seekers. So he does seem to be going down the same route as his predecessors. Arguably, then in Labour terms, he's failing. Clean energy, well, this has become very controversial. Ed Miliband's net zero sort of zeal is being tested, but the figures speak for themselves. Over the years since the election, the renewables share of our energy mix has actually declined. And there's clear signs for government's backtracking in certain areas, particularly, for example, on drilling for oil in the North Sea, which, if you recall, when Trump came as the head, not just of the US government, but clearly of the US oil lobby, he recommended that they drill, baby, drill. What about reducing crime? Well, they did promise to take back the streets. Yvette Cooper pledged to reverse quite high levels of crime in town centres. She promised new officers, police officers, community support officers. But unfortunately, knife crime has continued to rise. As you know, I don't know if you live in London, but in London, it's not particularly good. And more common crimes are on the rise. And also the number of police patrolling British neighbourhoods has gone down, not up. So arguably they're failing on crime. And finally, house building. Well, obviously, when Angela Rayner resigned, with her ultimately went Labour's sort of very steadfast commitment to reaching this target of building 1.5 million homes within 5 years of taking office. Now, that target will not be reached. That target was always going to be extremely unrealistic. And unfortunately, the main obstacle, the planning rules in this country, which the government very rightly wants to address, haven't been changed. The planning and infrastructure bill has yet to clear the House of Lords. So as a result, house builders are holding back because they don't want to start building and committing unless they've got a kind of clear trajectory to earn profits. That's how they work. And they haven't yet. So it's kind of just in limbo, really. Arguably, at the moment, failing. They'll have to do something very radical to pull a rabbit out of a hat with house building if they want to reach that target. And if they want to make a difference to the many, many households that now require a home.
So in summary, it's really not going well, is it, Gavin?
Well, we always have these debates, don't we, about governments in office, and they have only been in office for 1 year. I think it's really important to remember that the next election won't be for another 3.5 years, 4 years. There is time.
Got enough time to move things on and change things around. I mean, it must be difficult going for this new government to get it all together within a year. I can understand the point about that. Is there time? Are they going to survive the next 3 years?
I think they'll survive in government the next 3 years. I think the real question will be whether Kier Starmer will survive as Prime Minister for the next 3 years. And so if you recall, under the Tories, we had a number of prime ministers changed while they were in power. There were not elections. We just suddenly overnight had a new prime minister. That's how the British Constitution works. And so I think the issue really for Labour is, do they want to sort of stick the course with Kier, or do they want someone else? And that obviously is rearing its head and reared its head just before the conference, with the potential for a leadership challenge.
I'd like to ask you, what was the outcome of the Labour Party conference, and what can the public expect to see happen next?
Given what we've discussed, the conference was described by commentators as the last chance saloon for Kier Starmer. In fact, Labour ended the conference with a kind of sense of relief, almost upbeat, that it had avoided major problems, in particular this kind of looming, or the potential for a leadership challenge by Andy Burnham, which is another aspect of the problems that Kier Starmer faces. But conferences are always very insular affairs. They talk to each other about their own. It's a bit like a work conversation at dinner. You know, outside of the parameters of that conversation, no one else is included. And that means us, the rest of the country. They can actually fail badly to capture the national mood. So they tell us more about internal party dynamics than how a party is actually faring in the country. But we can take 2 lessons away. First of all, Starmer was not challenged. And of course, he can't be challenged unless Andy Burnham, who's not an MP, becomes an MP, at least. So he's limping on with a new sort of energy in his stride. He tried to come out fighting in his speeches, signalling clearly to his critics that he's not going to go lightly. He's going to fight. And he obviously did signal, as you say, some big initiatives. There were lots of big headlines leading up to conference, which kind of signaled that he's, not going to go lightly.
Are there wider implications of this conference, for example, on the international stage? We do talk about, this is Last Week on Earth, we talk about international politics and news agenda as well. Can you just talk us through that quickly before we sign off?
I think there are, but they kind of have to be teased out. I think one of the biggest implications is this vulnerability to the markets, the financial markets, the bond markets, because this does actually play into broader questions about ultimately who runs Britain. Is it the elected government, or is it market traders who are responding to changes in yields and this kind of shenanigans? And these are issues that are being faced not just in Britain. So at the moment, France has a problem with national debt. They're facing, in fact, if you talk to economists, they will probably all tell you that France is more likely to have a debt crisis before Britain at the moment, and its public finances are equally bad. And the reason we're so worried about this is what happened to Truss. So we mentioned Liz Truss earlier, but the markets went into meltdown because she mishandled a pronouncement about the public finances. It's interesting that if you talk to some economists, they will say that the actual pronouncements for Liz Truss kind of policy wasn't necessarily madly off kilter. What was off kilter is how she handled it. And that's all about how markets respond to government rhetoric and the tone of economic policy making. In our case, the bond markets are really significant because Rachel Reeves has already had trouble with the bond markets. And it's no coincidence that Andy Burnham, the potential challenger to Keir Starmer, has started talking about the bond markets. And he's saying, like some other left of centre Labour MPs, I wouldn't say left wing because I don't think that really applies to Labour anymore, but certainly centre left Labour MPs are saying, look, we can't let the bond markets determine the outcome of our politics. We need to start borrowing more money as a country in order to solve some of our pressing policy issues. So I think that's one of the wider implications of this. It feeds into an international debate about the role of the bond markets and who runs governments. But there are other international implications. I mean, foreign policy, for example, getting a grip on migration is obviously just about Britain. But if you think that one of the main aspects of rhetoric coming out of the United States, critical rhetoric towards Britain, has been about migration, because the US, of course, is charting its own course on migration, which I think they feel that Britain should be following. And Britain clearly is very resistant to do that. Foreign policy. Now, Burnham, for example, has signaled that he wants us to have a much more assertive foreign policy. What that means in coded language is not to stick up to the United States, not to kind of be so much of a poodle. Britain has been a poodle. It's been a poodle since Blair. It's still a poodle. They were fawning over Donald Trump when he visited this country. Is that good for the country? Arguably, a real politic would suggest maybe. You can't afford to upset this guy. But ultimately, there are issues of national pride here and democracy. Who runs this country? Do we run it because we're trying to keep up with the Americans, or do we have our own democracy? And as a result, that relationship with America will affect other things. So if Starmer was to go and Burnham was to take over, that would have dramatic implications for our US special relationship. And ultimately, that would feed through to policies, for example, in the Middle East, policies towards Israel, perhaps policies towards Ukraine in Europe. So yes, there are implications of a small insular party conference, especially when it's in government, as Labour is.
Gavin, that's all we've got time for today on Last Week on Earth. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll be back with episode 3 next Friday on your favourite podcast platform. Just search Last Week on Earth. For now, I'm Louisa Magnussen. Thank you for listening. I wish you a good week ahead. Gavin, goodbye.
Goodbye.